Hey guys, I'm going to walk you through the different parts of a sewing machine, and maybe this looks a lot like the one you have at home or has some similarities, so hopefully you'll be able to figure yours out. Basically this is your standard home sewing machine, inexpensive, doesn't have to be super fancy. We really just need it to sew a straight stitch, so as long as it does that then you're good. This one is one from the TAM department, so it's got like stickers with numbers on it so we can keep track of it, and this one's definitely seen a lot of use. So you've got your basic machine, you'll have some kind of foot pedal, right, that's going to plug in to the side here, right? Oh, my pieces are coming apart. But your foot pedal is going to have the same end piece that plugs into the side so you can get power, and that's so that you can turn the machine on, power it up, but so you can also use the foot pedal when you sew. And so you're going to put that down on the table underneath and use that just like you might drive a car. It's going to be the same. So just like learning to drive a car, it's going to feel really sensitive at first, and you're going to go too fast and you're going to make mistakes, but then slowly you'll get the hang of it. What I also want to point out, and I'll say this over and over again, is this wheel on the side of the sewing machine that they all have. This also sews, right? So say you didn't have a foot pedal back in the day before there was electricity and they had invented sewing machines. The first ones you would just turn by hand, and notice how this mechanism here, which is the part going up and down, it's working just by turning it by hand. So worst case, if you're sewing and you're not wanting to use that foot pedal, or you're still working it out, I often just sew by hand, turning the wheel there. So I'll talk about this again and again. So basically up here is where you're going to put your thread. So you've got a couple different spaces. There's two that are going to hold your big spool of thread like this. No bigger than this. These types of home machines are really not made to hold spools that are much larger than this. They obviously make much larger ones for industrial machines or different types of machines, but really like your basic, this says 225 yards, maybe about 250, 300 yard thread spools this size are going to be what's going to go on here. These pull out so it gets higher. See how it goes in? This is basically so I can easily store it. Yours probably does the same thing. If this ever goes down and you think it's broken, I can't, put my spool on there, just pull it up. It probably fixes it right there. And you've got two of them, and you have two so that you could have maybe two different colors, kind of waiting at the same time. This little guy here is going to be how we're going to wind our bobbin, and I'll talk about that in a second. So the way that sewing machines work is that you've got a thread coming from the top thread, and you've got a thread that's going to come from down underneath the bottom, and the two come together and interlock with every stitch. That's what makes sewing machines stronger than hand stitches. The two threads are interlocking every single time, so it's also a delicate mechanism. It has to go together just right to make it work. If it misses the stitch and they don't interlock, well, the whole thing falls apart. It doesn't work. So there's a top thread and a bottom thread, and the bottom thread is going to be called the bobbin thread. So we'll talk about that. But so this is where, say, your thread spool is going to go. These have little holes on the bottom, so that can sit up there. Sometimes those are set a little different. Sometimes they go to the side. We'll talk about that. But in this one, it looks like it sits upright. This also has a handle so that you can carry it if you need to transport it around. There's going to be, usually on home machines, kind of, if you can see here, it's like giving me an arrow here, an arrow here, a 1, a 3, here's a 2, a 4. It's giving you instructions on how to thread the machine. What I suggest is if you have a sewing machine and you bought it and say it came with a manual, there's probably a page that shows you here's how you thread your machine, and it shows you exactly step by step. I would always have that out until you get really familiar with threading it. If you have a machine and you don't have the manual, Google it. Look at the exact, make and model. Google it. I'm sure you will be able to find a page that shows you exactly how to thread your machine. But usually once you get good at it, you can walk up to any machine and should be able to thread it just knowing the basics of how it works, but also potentially following these instructions that are often on a lot of these home machines where they're showing you 1, 2, 3, 4. So the different parts are basically, you've got, here is your thread. It's a selector, and again, it might be different on your machine, but what this is, it's A through L, it looks like right here. This is referring to this grid over here, which is showing you all the different types of stitches it can do. A lot of home machines, they do a lot of different fancy stitches. I can tell you, I never use any of those stitches. There's really not many cases where they're going to come in handy. The one that I'm going to use is the straight stitch that is dead center. So that is the first one here, it's A. So just if it shows you a grid like this, or if you've got one in a book or something like that, just look and make sure what you want to be sewing on is the straight stitch, normal straight stitch that is dead in the center of your presser foot, which is what's going to be down here. And in the photo, it just kind of shows one that's straight, but it's off to the left. So we want the center one. So that's number A. The length is referring to stitch length. So we've talked about that when we've been hand sewing. It's the length of the actual stitches between one stitch to the next. So this goes 1 to 4. Sometimes they'll go up a little bit higher as well. I've got it set on 3. This is a good, great general stitch length. You can adjust slightly and kind of see how it goes. When we do some tests, you can see what size stitch length you want. But something that's not too big, that you can easily say rip it right out. Remember when we did that big, larger basting stitch, it was easy to just pull right out. But then also something that's not so small that it's hard to pick out if you make a mistake and you need to pick it out. So that's why 3 is good. 2 I would do if I wanted something really tiny that was harder to remove, and 4 I would do if I wanted to be able to remove it. So 3 is a good middle stitch length. That's probably what I suggest for whatever machine you're using as well. And then here there's another knob called width, and this is referring to some of the fancier features that this machine could do. So again, I've got this one set to 0, which I think should mean it's not doing anything down here. So on your particular machine, you'll just have to make sure you are just set for the straight stitch, normal stitch, ready to go, nothing fancy. It does have a back stitch mechanism, which is here. So it's like a button you could push, and you can see what happens is, in this case, it drops. These are called the feed dogs. These are actually sort of guides that are going to help press your fabric along as you're putting fabric in the machine. These here are actually going to help it feed through really nice and easily. So that's what those are. They're called feed dogs. But when you press your back stitch, it lowers them down. This is so that when you are sewing at any point, you can actually sew backwards. I actually never, ever, ever hardly ever use the back stitch. I don't find it's the most efficient. I'll show you why when I'm sewing. A lot of people back tack or back stitch, at the beginning of a bit of work and at the end. I just find that usually this makes more trouble than it's worth, and I'll show you the way that I do it. I would say the more couture method, taking my time. This is if you're sewing really fast and you're in production and you do it all day nonstop every day in a sweatshop and you're really good at it and you're flawless. But even myself, I don't like to use the back stitch. I'll turn it around and sew in the opposite direction to sew backwards, if that makes sense. I'll show you what I mean when I get there. But that is what that's for. You'll probably have one somewhere on your machine too. Sometimes it's like a knob on the side, sometimes it's someplace else, but it's so that you can sew backwards. I'm trying to think what else we really need to talk about. So we've got where our stitch, or where our thread goes, and where our bobbin thread goes. This is the tension for the top thread, this dial here. Hopefully it's sort of set in a good place, a good middle area. Usually it sort of shows you, like I think on this machine, the 3 and the 4 and the 5 are kind of highlighted. Usually something in the middle, it might go from like say 1 to 6 or 7 or 8. Usually a middle tension is what you want. If it's already set on a tension, don't touch it. It's probably where it works best, and whoever was using your machine last or the factory settings, it's how they like it. So you shouldn't have to mess with that much. But this is if your top thread was feeling like a little loose and you needed to adjust the tension, or if it was feeling a little tight. That's what this is. This is the tension that's holding this thread in place when we get it all threaded. You're going to thread around this little guy. You're going to thread under here. You've got this take up lever. See, as I'm sewing towards myself, you can see that this is going down, and you can barely see. There we go. This comes up. This is also going to hold onto your thread. So that guy's going to see he hides. He comes up and he hides. So that's happening in there. Thread's going to go through here. It catches around one more little piece here, and it even has one more thread guide down here right before the needle's going to go in, and I'll show you how we do that. I think these are most of the bits. Oh, in the back here, whoops, this part comes off on purpose, but I keep accidentally pulling it off. Where is it? Oh, there we go. It's actually on the, it's actually like impossible to see in my view. Oh, here, right here, this black bit here. This is going to raise and lower my presser foot when I install it. Okay, so there should be a lever there that's going to raise and lower this mechanism here. That's going to be for your presser foot. You'll have a light that comes on probably from right here once I plug this in. And I'll start showing you how to put the pieces on. So this is your standard presser foot. Probably looks something like this. Very symmetrical, very even, opening right in the dead center. Your needle basically is going to go into that hole over and over, and your thread's going to be able to pass through there. So to put this on, it's going to go right in here on the bottom. Let's see if we can help you to see. And in this machine here, do you see this little lever back here? This comes up and down to kind of let different attachments, like this presser foot, come on. So see if I pull that up. Oops, there we go. Pull it up. And now this presser foot's locked in place. If I push it up, it falls right back off, okay? So this might already be on your machine. Again, if someone used it last, they probably have it set up with the foot on there. And if it came from the factory, it might already be on there. But if you need to take it off, if you need to switch it out, your machine might have come with several different feet. They do different purposes. This is going to be the standard one you're going to sew with all the time, but you might change it out. So this is how you do it. You've got this little lever back here, and it's going to accept that. And then once it's locked in place and it's not falling out, then you're good to go. So called the presser foot because it actually presses down on the fabric and keeps it in place. So again, I'm using this lever that for me is found sort of in the back and on the inside here. And now see, like my fabric sort of locked down. It's being held in place by that presser foot. And when I raise it, I can pull it right back out again. So this is very handy to create just the perfect amount of tension from your fabric to the machine to keep it all in the correct place. Another type of presser foot that we will use or could use is this one. This is a zipper foot. And with this, whoops, with this one, it just allows you to get the needle very, very, very close, see, on either side. Whereas this other presser foot, remember, the needle was going right through the dead center to make a stitch line. This is going to come a little to the side of the center. And imagine, you know, if I was sewing on a zipper, and look, I have one right here, so I'll show you. If I was sewing on a zipper, I would want to come really close to that zipper teeth, but not like on top of it. And look how this foot is designed to glide right along the zipper teeth. And imagine my needle could go right into that spot right beside, and even on the other side too. It just lets it get really, really close. It's not absolutely essential. I often put in zippers without a zipper foot out of laziness to put it on, But if you have it, it does make your life so much easier. And when you go to put in that zipper, you'll really thank yourself. So if you have it, great. If you don't have it, it might be something that you might want to consider ordering or finding for your machine. You can get it at Joann's, you can get it online for not terribly expensive, so it might really be worth it. So that's another foot that we might use. Aside from that, things that you've got are the bobbin case and the bobbin, okay? And these go down here. Remember this piece that keeps opening? This comes off so that you can get down here underneath. And this is where the bottom thread is going to live. So the bobbin gets wound with thread, and I'll show you how to do that up at the top. And it slips inside, fits in there perfectly. You really want to make sure you have the right size bobbin for your bobbin case. It's pretty standard. You can go back to the materials list and make sure, but you know, whatever came with your machine is probably right. These are just slightly different sizes for some, you know, different machines, especially industrial machines. So if it doesn't feel like it sits in there and then pops out like really, really easily, then it might not be the right size. So you just want to make sure you're getting the right size for your home sewing machine. Your bobbin case also probably has this big hook on the end, right? And another thing it's got is this. It's like a little door, I always call it. It's like this little latch hook swinging mechanism. This is really integral for how you're going to place it inside the machine. So let me see if I can get a little closer with my camera and I'll show you how to do that. Okay, so say you've got your bobbin threaded and we're gonna go ahead and put it in the machine. So you're going to make sure that this little hook is facing up. And I usually, when I place it in, I just have my thumb opening this little lever and I hold on to it. That's kind of how I grip it, right? See, I'm holding on not to the whole case, but I'm holding on just to this little door. And I'm kind of leaning it back this way because if I at any point, you know, go that way, my bobbin falls right out, which is gonna happen, it's gonna happen, it always happens, it's okay. But try kind of feel it out in your hand. See, I'm kind of tilting back and I'm holding it by this door. And what you're going to do is place it straight in. So this hook is up and I've got the little door open and I've placed it straight in. There's only one correct way for this to go. Once I've got it in, I can kind of let that close, right? And what I want is for this to feel locked in place, which it does. Now that I've placed this in here, I can't take it out. It won't come out. It's like stuck. It won't spin, it won't move. It's stuck in. The way that you release it is with this little lever, this little door. So once I do that, whoops, I can pull it back out again, okay? So that's how you know you've done it right. If I say don't have this, see I'm putting it in kind of sideways, it'll spin. See how it's like moving? It's spinning freely. It's not locked in place. That is not what you want. If that's happening, you're gonna have nothing but problems. So make sure that you take the time to position it correctly, open up your lever, and lock it in place. And I can kind of feel that it clicks, okay? So that's what you want. You wanna feel that this has clicked in place and it's not moving until you open up that latch, which releases it, okay? In this case where I can kind of see these guys are holding this in place, you just wanna make sure everything looks like it's very flat and neat and sitting properly. Again, hopefully the way that you've got your machine, it isn't already a hot mess, so it's ready to go. But just keep an eye on the way things look so that you can ever see if you look at it and you're like, wait, something looks slightly different than it normally does. That would be an indication of why you'd be having sewing problems, okay? So once that's locked in place, you can close that back up and you can place this back on if you want. You could sew with this off. This just helps give you like a place for some of your extra fabric to set. The next thing we'll do is our needles. And so again, I've got universal home sewing machine needles in size 12, which is written down here at the bottom. I can slide this, whoops, there we go. Get one of these guys. And the sewing machine needle for the home sewing machine is going to be flat on one side. You can kind of feel it. So I've got a flat side and a round side. I don't know if you can kind of see here, but yeah, one side is flat and the other side is round. These machines are going to be threaded front to back, basically. So what that means is the hole in the needle, which I see, I want to see it. And I will always place my thread through that hole from the front going towards the back. Some machines might be to the side, so you would thread exactly, sideways, but we're always going to go front to back with home machines. And that's also why this is flat, so that you can really easily feel it and put it into the correct place. So you're going to insert this needle, if it isn't already, right in here. Let me bring this a little bit closer and see if you can see. And I'm going to push that all the way up until I can't push it anymore. This knob here is going to be what tightens it. So if you're not able to get the needle in, maybe it's because this is already tightened, so loosen it up. You'll just place it right in, try not to scratch the tip, and I'm feeling that the back, the flat back, is flat against the back, and then I tighten it until it is completely tightened. Let's see. Oops. And notice how, so I actually, just when I put this needle in, it's hard to see, I'm gonna create like some sort of shadow. You can really see this. I can see that my needle is off to the left. It should always be in the dead center of my presser foot. I should be able to see that this needle is going into the center, but I can see that mine is slightly off to the left. So this was a clear indication that something is up with my settings. So I'm actually going to adjust this one that I thought I had right, set at 0, and then I noticed, look, I even marked for myself a little marker by the number 3. This, moving the width, is what put it to the dead center. And that's what I want. I want this needle to be in the very center of my presser foot as I sew. So that's definitely something to look out for. Maybe, again, if at any point your settings have accidentally moved or you've shifted them and your needle isn't in the center, well, you're not going to be sewing in the right place. So go ahead and make sure it's in the dead center of your presser foot, okay? So as long as everything is looking good there, everything's tight, these two pieces are all connected, we can get some thread and we'd be ready to sew. So we are going to thread the bobbin thread using the bobbin threader up at the top here, which is this shorter thread holder that the bobbin kind of sits right on perfectly, not these really long ones that are going to hold the big fat thread, our big top spool of thread, right here. So we're going to thread this, and in order to do that, it's going to push over to this side. Okay, so I'll show you how you do it. We're first going to get our larger spool of thread in the color that we want, and we'll put this on the back. And we're going to follow what might be sort of written on the top of your machine. I can see I've got one little arrow here and another little arrow here. And this is going to be how to wind the bobbin. Your machine probably also has this in its manual, or you could look it up for how to wind the bobbin very specifically. So I'm going to wrap around this little wheel here, and what happens is this just gives it like a little bit of tension, okay, before it comes back over here to wind on the bobbin. And that's what I can see it's telling me by these arrows. So I've got this wrapped around, and then you're going to want to need it to basically have tension to stay on here. So usually the bobbins have a hole right in the center. Sometimes they're metal, sometimes they're plastic. This one's plastic, but it has a little hole right in the center. So I come from inside, not like from the top, not from the bottom, from the inside of the spool, right? As though I'm wrapping around the spool, which is what will happen. And I'm coming from the inside out through that hole. And I only do this just so I can not lose my thread when it first starts winding up, right? Sometimes it just doesn't grip. So this way you can kind of hold on to it for a second so that it's not gonna get lost. I stick this right on here. Okay, so this guy, and I could even pull that tension at first. And while I'm starting, I usually just ever so slightly hold on to this piece just enough again so that once it starts winding, it's not gonna like just roll right off. Does that make sense? You'll kind of get it, I think, once you do it. So I'm holding on to that, and then to activate the winding of the bobbin, to make that mechanism work, you press it to the right, okay? So now holding on to this ever so slightly, I'm gonna use my presser foot to start winding it up. Ooh, let's see. I'm gonna have to place this down. You can see the thread is wrapping around, and it's going up and down to wrap around the bobbin nice and evenly. And what will happen is when this gets full, it should stop on its own, but you could also stop it early just by stopping when you've decided that it's the size that you want. And you've got enough thread on there to do your project. So you can go ahead and fill it all the way up, or you can stop it early. So now we're going to thread the top part of the machine. So we've got our spool resting on top, and we're going to follow our numbers or instructions if there are any, and also kind of follow the basics. So I know that this is going to go under this little pull here. It's shown there with the number 1, but I know that it's going to have some tension on it right here. It's a thread guide. It's going to go down. This is 1, and my 2 is down here. So I'm going to pull this, and it actually shows a little loop. So it's going back up, so I pull it up. And I know what happens now is that it needs to go into this thread guide. So I'm going to walk my machine with the wheel towards me until this thread guide pops up, and then I'm going to loop around that, and then it comes back down into number 4 here. So there's another thread guide down here, and there's actually one more little loop very close to the needle down here that I'll also use. And then the next step is I go right through the needle from front to back. So I could trim my thread, just like threading a hand sewing needle. I want to make sure that's nice and crisp so that it's easy to thread. And I'm going to go front to back. I can pull that through. There we go. Make sure I don't get any knots, make sure it looks good. And then what I like to do right away once I've got some thread here is pull it underneath the presser foot and towards the back of the machine. When you sew, this is where the thread's going to end up going anyway, is towards the back. So I just go ahead and get it in that position that it needs to be now. So I'm going to leave that towards the back. And I'm going to make sure that I pull like 6 to 10 inches of extra out. I don't want to have just this tiny little bit of thread kind of dangling right here, because then what happens is sometimes when you go to make that first stitch, it pulls it up and you lose your thread, right? And you have to rethread the whole thing. So just like when I'm sewing by hand, I kind of always have that extra tail of like 6 inches, 6 to 10 hanging off to the side. So this will just make it so that I definitely am not going to lose that thread, not have to rethread it. So I put that towards the back. Now I can thread my bobbin. So remember, I filled my bobbin. I'm going to place it in my bobbin case. And while we're talking a little bit more about the bobbin case, here, this little screw on the side is actually the tension for the bobbin thread. If you ever felt that your bobbin thread needed tensioning that was adjusting, maybe it was too loose or too tight, you can turn this like slightly with your fingernail or a really tiny screwdriver to adjust that, but you shouldn't have to. The only other times I've ever had to adjust it is when you feel that it's really, really tight, and I'll show you how to pull it through. So on the bobbin case, there is one little divot in the metal. So you're going to take your thread and pull it there. And you're going to go under this little metal piece here, so that your goal is that you are now, the thread is coming out of this long open section, okay? And I can pull, and it pulls really nice and evenly. If this ever feels tight or stiff or difficult to pull, something's wrong. I'd say pop that bobbin out, do it again. Something got stuck in there, some dust, some fabric, whatever. It's just not in there right, something's stopping it. So it should always feel nice and smooth. If you've checked it and checked it and checked it and everything's right and it still feels stiff, this is when you can make slight adjustments to that screw. But for the most part, it should just feel nice and smooth and never get stuck on you. So now that I've got a big bunch of thread coming out of that hole, again like 6 to 10 inches, I can load my bobbin case like I showed you earlier. So pulling this off, opening this up, and remember I'm going to have my hook up, my little door latch open, and I'm going to place it straight back in until it feels like it locks in place, and then I'll close my latch. I always check, I jiggle it to make sure it is not free moving in there, to make sure this is locked in place. Then I've got this thread kind of hanging out to the side here. I've got my top thread in the back here, and now I'm going to pull the bobbin thread up. This is essential. You need to do this before you start sewing. So holding on to my top thread, just so I don't lose it, just to give a little bit of tension on that, I'm going to go to my wheel, the side wheel that lowers my needle down, and I'm going to turn it towards me like one rotation so that I can see the needle has dropped down in to catch the bobbin thread. I keep pulling until I see that now it's come up, and you'll see that it grabs that thread. You can see the loop happening under there. Usually this is where I take some scissors or a pencil or something now that I can slide underneath here, and you can see, look, I've got that bottom thread caught in a loop with my top thread, and then I can pull that right up. So now I have 2 threads right here, one coming from the bottom, one coming from the needle, and I test and both of them pull with nice even tension. Oh, look at that. While I was down there, I noticed there was just a straight thread. Definitely always check that there's nothing clogged in here. There isn't bits of fiber, bits of fabric, bits of thread. That's a really common issue for why your machine's being funny. So I'm glad I caught that now. So get that out of the way. It happens all the time. There's always little bits of thread that end up just down there. So anyway, now that I've got 2 bits, I can close this back up. I can take both of these, whoops, and place them back behind, put this back together, and I can test the machine. So I do this with a scrap piece of fabric. It can be a scrap piece of muslin. In this case, I have a little scrap piece of purple cotton. And I can do 1 layer and just place it in the machine. Often when I'm testing, mostly because this is what I'll typically be sewing, is I fold it and I do 2 layers just to mimic the material that I am about to sew on. And before I sit down and start sewing on my real project, I always do a test on some sample fabric. You want to make sure that you just loaded the machine correctly, that you just you know, did everything right, that everything's good, that the tensions are good before you mess up potentially your real project. So this is always what I do. I always start with a sample piece of fabric that doesn't matter. So when you're sewing anything, you're going to place your fabric under the presser foot like this. Get this a little closer for you guys if you want. And then you're going to place the presser foot down. This locks it in place. So never sew with the presser foot up. It is not meant to do that. You will have issues in no time. It'll be just a big jumbled mess. So presser foot down. And what I like to also do is make sure the needle is down. Again, you can't really start making a stitch with the needle up in the air. It has to be through the fabric, so I might as well go ahead and start with the needle in the fabric every time. And so to do that, again, I come back to my wheel and I walk it. I call it walking as opposed to, like, if I'm using the presser foot, I'm driving, right? So here I'm walking the wheel, walking the machine. And I just turn it towards me, always towards yourself, never away. It's meant to go towards you until the needle has lowered into the fabric, okay? Now, this is totally locked in place. Nothing is moving about this. Even if I picked up my presser foot, it's locked in place because there's a needle going through it. So this just means I am in a good starting place to sew. I know this is not moving. I can feel really good about it. Another habit that I always do is these extra threads that I'm starting with, on the first 1 or 2 stitches, I hold on to them. So this might make more sense as you sew later, but again, the idea of the sewing machine is that you've got a top thread and a bottom thread, and they're looping together every time. On that first stitch, it's easy, especially if you don't have enough thread back here, for it to take up too much of a bit of your thread to make that first loop. So I want to just make sure I give a little bit of tension so that even that first loop is flawless. From the first loop down to the last. You'll see what I mean if you ever sew and right where you started the stitch line, you've got a big bunch of thread just balled up at the back and you're like, I don't understand, where did that come from? What happens was it just sucked up all of this thread that you had here, just sucked it up and spun it and didn't know what to do with it for a little hot second. So by holding on to this when I start for just the first 1 or 2 stitches, I'm just giving it the perfect tension, just like all of the machine here is giving it tension throughout. It just doesn't have any tension on these threads. So again, I'll just walk that first 1 and now 2 stitches. And now I'm good to go. Now I could drive with my presser foot and feel very confident that this is locked in place. All the stitches are going to be perfect and it's going to do what I want it to do. So I can use the presser foot now and just slowly let that go through. Notice that you don't have to push it through. It'll go through on its own. My hand is here, I'm not pushing it. The feed dogs underneath, that's what they do. They glide the thread through naturally. So you do not need to push, you do not need to pull. All your hand is doing is guiding it in the right direction, making sure it doesn't go to the side. So it pretty much goes straight by itself. Look at that. You don't need to do much. You are very gently guiding that thread. So say here when I come to the end, right, I could come right off the fabric, or I could choose very carefully to stop at the end and make sure, you know, wherever I want to finish that last stitch, I'll go all the way in. But before I try to pull my fabric up, I have to make sure that that needle is up. Obviously, we can't remove the fabric if the needle's still down. So just go ahead and complete that last stitch by pulling the needle up. Also now, it's still locked in place with the presser foot. So lift up your presser foot and you should be able to just pull this out very gently. Should never be a struggle. If you get to this point and you have to be like tugging on this piece of fabric, what it means is that it's caught on the last stitch. That last loop isn't completed yet. And in that case, you just need to literally come over to the wheel and just walk it like a little millispace, just a little bit. Sometimes I even literally kind of give it a jiggle just to make sure that it's completed that last stitch. And then I promise you, you should be able to pull so smoothly. Your machine probably has something around here that you can cut the threads with. Mine has it right here on the side. So see, I just rubbed that there and it cut the threads. Otherwise, I always have a little pair of scissors with me when I'm sewing so that I can cut the threads, so that I can swoop under and pick up the bobbin thread. So here's the stitch line that I sewed. This was a very wrinkly piece of fabric. Usually I don't like to sew on anything so wrinkly, but you can see the stitch. And what I'm looking for is that it's nice and even. I don't see any loops. I don't see any stitches that aren't as tight as the others. I see nice even tension. I see a nice even stitch length. It looks nice. It looks professional. And then what I want to check is that it looks the same on the back. And you can see here, is this where I started? This is kind of what I was talking about. Look how, see how when it started, I've got an uneven tension, right? I've got some loops that aren't as tight. So maybe even though I was holding on to it, it just didn't give it the perfect tension that I wanted right there. But again, at least this is easy to fix. I can sort of just pull on that other thread from the back and the tension fixes itself. What I would not want is if something like that had happened in the middle of my stitch line here. That would mean it's weak. That would mean it's a point where if I pull on it, I can kind of pull it open. So I want a nice, even, pretty stitch. And usually what I like to do, because even though it's stitched pretty evenly, often the thread tries to gather up the fabric a bit. So I like to take my 2 fingers, and I don't notice neither of these sides are locked in. This is open, it's not tied off. This is open, it's not tied off. I'll take my fingers and I'll just push all the thread to one side so that I'm getting out any unnecessary gathering or tension in each side, so that now I have a beautiful, flat, perfect stitch. Then and only then would I tie off one of my ends if I wanted to lock that stitch in place, only after I made sure my tension was perfect. This is why I don't like to do something like the back stitch, because it would have locked in both sides, and then if it was gathered up a little bit, I wouldn't be able to release that tension. So I'm just pulling the tension out. I'm just letting those 2 threads work themselves out to the open end. If I wanted to tie this off, what I do on an end where they both meet at the end is I literally, take each piece of thread, and you could tie in a double knot, and then clip, and now that's tied off. And say in this case where it doesn't come to the end, right? I can pull the thread through to one side and tie it. And see how I do that? I can take the bit of my scissors or a pin and get some of this extra thread out of the way. I can pull both to one side like this. So now I have 2 pieces of thread on one side, not here, so that I could tie these off into a little knot and have my stitch line be locked in place. Something happened and I must have accidentally just cut this one short, because I know I had many more inches, but I could still tie this little baby's, still tie that into a tiny little knot, and then this would be locked in place if I wanted to do that. And that way, instead of back stitching, if I ever need to remove this stitch later, it's really easy to remove. It's just tied with a little light double knot. If I knew this was an area on a garment that I was totally finished with and I knew I wanted to definitely lock in place, I could do a back stitch, I could sew over it again to secure it. But for the most part, I usually just tie a little double knot on each end, and I don't stress it because I know probably, you know, the way that I'm going to construct things, this is going to be caught into another seam, it's not going to come undone, and it just makes it so much nicer and neater not to have all these big back tacks that are locking your stitches in place and potentially making problems. So when we typically sew seams, we're sewing at a certain seam allowance, which means if, say, I was sewing, again, these 2 sides of fabric together, the 2 ends, I would say sew, you know, here, and this extra would be the seam allowance. It's sort of the extra inside bit, so you don't sew so close to the edge that it frays right open, and you're sewing a little bit away from the edge, but it's just on the inside, and then you would only see, you know, this pretty outside. So the seam allowance is what's going to be marked on the side here. All of these markings on this plate that you're going to sew to. So usually when we sew, we're sewing at a very specific length from the edge, if that makes sense. Typically, we're going to sew at a 1/2 inch from the edge. A 1/2 inch seam allowance is a really common one. 5/8 is often used in home sewing patterns. A 1/4 inch from the edge is another popular one. But for the most part, most of our seams are going to be 1/2 inch. So what you're going to need to do is really look at these different lines that are here on the side and kind of make sure you know which is which. So 4/8 is this here. It's the one that's kind of darkest, and in this case it goes right through this little hole, which is like almost another guideline to hit. 4/8 is 1/2. It's the same thing, is 1/2 inch. So this is where we're typically going to sew. So what that means is I'm going to take my fabric and see how I'm placing it along that edge. If I was sewing at 5/8, well, I would move it right there. And if I was sewing at 6/8, well, I would move it right there. You see how I'm just moving it over. So if I was going to sew at a 1/4 inch, that's actually right in line with the presser foot itself. So in that case, I would line up the fabric, see how it's just in line with the edge of the presser foot. Because what happens is, see, my needle is going to hit right here in the middle, which is exactly a 1/4 inch away from the edge of this presser foot. So in cases when I say sew at a 1/4 inch, that's where I want you to sew. I'm lifting this back up. And in cases of a 1/2 inch, I want you to sew here, which is 4/8. Okay, so you've got this little gap. And your goal the whole time while you're sewing is to just keep your fabric going along the edge of that line. So again, I'll start. So I'll put my presser foot down, needle down. Again, I'm giving a little tension here for that first 1 or 2 stitches. I'm walking the first 1 or 2 stitches. You could walk all the stitches. I am just hand walking this right now. And then if you're feeling more confident, you can come and use the presser, or not the presser foot, but the pedal. And now I am just making sure this fabric stays right on that 4/8 line. Going nice and slow and steady so that I'm going to have it exactly a 1/2 inch from the edge, which will give me a 1/2 inch seam allowance. When I get to the end, I stop, make sure my needle's up, presser foot up, and I can pull my threads. Okay, so here I've got, look, a beautiful 1/2 inch exactly from that edge that goes all the way down. So this is definitely something I want you to do, is to practice sewing at a 1/2 inch from the edge. We could also, even right on top of that, sew at a 1/4 inch from the edge. So I'll put it back down, presser foot down, needle down, walking those first 2, and now I'm going to keep it right in line with the edge of the foot. I'm not pushing or pulling the fabric. I'm just gliding it. Okay, and there I've got a 1/4 inch from the edge. Perfectly nice and straight and even, 1/4 inch, 1/2 inch seam allowance, okay? So I want you to practice some really nice straight lines that are at a certain seam allowance. I want you to do a 1/4 inch seam allowance. I want you to do a 1/2 inch seam allowance. So from the edge, 1/4 inch from the edge, 1/2 inch from the edge. And you can also try pivoting. So I'm going to put presser foot down, needle in, start those first 2, and you can try some more freehand. You could do turns, turning the fabric, just being a little free with it. See if you can do a circle. Maybe I could even do a spiral. And then at any point, see now I've got like a circle just by turning the fabric. That's all I did. At any point, if I wanted to make like a 90-degree, like a harsh turn, when the needle, I could go one more, when the needle is all the way in the fabric, remember I can pick up my presser foot and it's not going anywhere. So what I would do is, leaving the needle down, I would just pick up my presser foot and turn the fabric. And then put my presser foot back down, and I could sew again. So here. So I've got the needle down, and I can sew again a little bit. And at any point that I want to pivot, needle down, presser foot up, and I can turn completely in any direction. So if you can see what I've sewn here, I'll do one more. And then I can pick this up, gently pull, and you can see I was able to turn the fabric and do a circle, and then by picking up the presser foot with the needle still in, I can turn the fabric and make even these very harsh turns, right? And so whatever shapes that I want, and they look exactly the same and beautiful on the back. Nice even tension. You could practice tying off knots at any point. So I can pull this, give it a little tug, and then I see the loop from the other fabric. I could usually pull it with my hands, or I could take a pin or my scissors. And now I've got both threads on this side to be able to tie into a double knot, so that here in the back, for example, like you wouldn't be able to see, it would just end and it would be locked in place. And I would have like, I practically already have like an S or something, a 5. I'm doing some freehand embroidery here. Okay, so what I want you to do is practice doing some straight lines. I want you to practice some circles and spirals. You can draw them out first on your fabric and then just follow the lines. That would be great. And I want you to also practice doing some turns and these 90-degree angles on your fabric.